Okay, cool. So looks like it is a small group with us today. Thank you to those of us who are there. Hopefully some more people will be popping in as we go. Yeah, I just wanted to say hello. My name is Laura Kruse. I am the Director of Communications and Organizing here at Public Interest Alberta. Along with my colleague Brad, we're very happy to be hosting this session tonight about the urgent need for protections for renters, especially as we have an opportunity to all of us kind of get aligned tonight in our messages that we want to bring to all the political parties as they are creating their platforms in advance of the provincial election next year. Before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. I think land acknowledgements are something that are very common in meetings in the spaces that we're all occupying. And I think that they are very valuable things, and also can kind of become relegated to this kind of formality that people do. So a few years ago, I took a session on land acknowledgements from a Indigenous poet from the Ktunaxa Nation named Smokey Sumac, who was talking about how when you do a land acknowledgement, rather than trying to remember all the numbers and rattling off the names and worrying about mispronouncing things, to just kind of speak from the heart and talk about your own relationship to the land. And I think that, one only has to go outside for a moment here in Edmonton to see that the housing crisis and the effects of colonization are deep and ongoing. We see that the vast majority of the people who are homeless on Edmonton streets, and I know this is the same for Calgary and throughout Alberta, are Indigenous people, and this is as a direct result of the policies of colonization that have, wrought all kinds of trauma and violence on people for generations. And I think that when we are talking about renter protections, when we are talking about expanding housing, we have the opportunity to lift all people up, which is in line with our treaty obligations, that we have a real commitment to every single person, be they settler or Indigenous in this territory, to be able to have access to the things they need in order to live a life that is full of dignity and opportunity. So with that, just a couple of things before I turn it over to my colleague Brad, which is that the session is being recorded, so it will be available afterwards. To improve the accessibility of our event, we do have the ability for you to access transcriptions, live transcriptions. They're certainly not perfect, but if they do help you, you can toggle them on. And if you find them distracting, you can turn them off as well. And we want to leave lots of time in this session for answering questions. So if you have questions as people are presenting, please feel free to pop them into the chat, and then we'll do our best to answer them, because it's easier for me as the moderator to be able to see them in there than it is for me to be watching the chat if it gets really active. So yeah, let's with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, who is the Executive Director of Public Interest Alberta, Bradley Lafortune.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, I will be very, very short and sweet, hopefully. The provincial election is less than 1 year away. We are very, very close to the provincial election. And I think the fact that the NDP is having this rentals consultation next week is a testament to the work that you all and we all have been doing together for the last several months and years to put renters' rights and renters' protections on the radar and on the agenda. Right now, we know that provincial parties are busy putting together their election platforms. One of them is in the midst of a leadership race. And so they're talking a lot about their priorities if they are successful, and we'll know more about that on October 6th. But basically what this moment boils down to is the priorities that provincial parties and leaders have. Basically, will they protect and strengthen public services for everyone in this province, or are they going to continue to slash and burn, cut and privatize those public services, including and especially housing, in the interests of their friends and insiders? And for far too long, this province, whether it was the PCs or quite frankly, any other political party that's been in power, there has been an outsized influence of those friends and insiders when it comes to housing policy. Quite simply, they haven't made renters' protections and renters' rights a priority. When you couple that reality and that history with the affordability crisis, record consumer debt, runaway inflation, and what we can only describe as the unraveling of our social safety net and public services, we really need to come together now to make the case that we need to put people first. And that includes renters. And that's why we're here tonight, obviously. Before and after and during elections, it doesn't matter. We don't get involved just, every 4 years and vote, although that's important. We need to be doing our advocacy all the time. And that's why we're getting together tonight, no matter what party is in power or no matter what party is in power. So we know that housing is a human right. We know that we say that, we know that we hear that, we know that it's enshrined in the UN Declaration of Housing as a Human Right. It's now in Canadian legislation as of 2019, but it doesn't really exist for far too many people. And when we talk about housing as a human right, we're really talking about adequate housing, and we're talking about affordable housing, and we're talking about a secure housing and dignified housing for everyone. And, as Laura said, you only have to look outside to realize that we're frankly failing on that front quite abysmally. In Edmonton here, it's a real crisis, and I know it is across the province and across Canada as well. We have twice as many people in this city experiencing homelessness as compared to March 2020 at the beginning of COVID. And this crisis is not inevitable. It's political and policy failure. And what we need to do now is to get all governments to act. We need to prioritize housing. We need to put it on the radar. We need to make demands that are clear, concise, and made with a unified voice. And so that's why I'm so excited to be here tonight with you all, and want to thank, ACORN and CJE and Laura from our office for putting this opportunity together, so that we can make a very, very clear set of demands to the NDP at the rental consultation that they need to prioritize renters' protections and rights over and above the interests of big landlords and developers in this province. And with that, I will turn it over to Alison.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for that. My name is Alison. I'm from her. I am a board member.
Alison, sorry to interrupt you, but your sound is pretty garbled right now.
Uh-oh. Is that better? No?
No.
How about that?
Are you using
Is that
headphones
good?
right now? Are
The
the
headphones aren't connected? But it was fine earlier?
It was fine earlier, yeah.
Oh, okay. Why don't we switch it up, and I'll try turning these off and turning them back on again. Can someone else, maybe Kyla, take over?
Sure.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry about that, Alison. And thanks, Kyla, for jumping in to fill the gaps. It's always It's always nice what happens today. I just wanted to add a couple of things to what Brad was saying, to add some additional context before we kind of turn it over to you, Kyla. I think that a lot of the times when we are talking about, you know, when we discuss things like homelessness, we often forget that there are like many steps before homelessness that we can intervene to create this, to make there are many steps that we can take to prevent that from happening. There are many interventions that the government can put in place today to keep that from happening. And I think that renter protections are a great one, because disproportionately renters make less money than people who are homeowners. And we know that, you know, over 50% of Albertans are $200 away from not making their financial obligations. We know that 1 in 3 renters nationally are concerned about making their rent next month. And we need to know that all parties, all of them, are making sure that the people who are forgotten by these short-sighted housing policies are being taken into consideration as we look at recovery from the last few years of devastation on our economy and on people's lives. So yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things there, and then I'll turn it over to Kyla, and hopefully Alison's situation's also figured out.
Yeah, sure. How's my sound?
It's great.
Okay. All right, perfect. Well, yeah, thanks everybody for coming. You know, my name's Kyla. I'm the lead organizer at Calgary and Alberta ACORN. So yeah, we did want to go over some of the policies that we'll be calling you know, the NDP, Alberta NDP, to put onto their platform for the provincial election, and just really starting off by going off of what Laura was saying, you know, stronger eviction protections. So, you know, more lenient rules for reasons like late payment of rent are needed to protect tenants. You know, $200 away from not meeting your financial you know, needs every month does not leave you a lot of wiggle room. So, you know, things come up and things happen, and, you know, having a crisis shouldn't mean that you're, you know, out on the street or you're evicted. So yeah, all evictions needing to be ordered by the RTDRS, which is Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Service, after a hearing or mediation with the landlord and tenant, and also just a full review of the eviction rules to ensure housing security for low to moderate income tenants in Alberta. And then another important one is community housing and social housing. So the province needs to embrace its fundamental role as a housing provider for low to moderate income families. And this really starts with repealing Bill 78, which privatized public housing by bringing in for-profit operators into the public housing system, and allows the province to sell off thousands of units with a loose promise that funds made off of these sales will be used to create housing. So yes, important to get rid of that, but then also building social housing again. So Alberta has 57,000 units of social housing, but we need that number to grow substantially. There's 20,000 households on the wait list currently, and that number is only growing. So building more social housing, it's also important that that housing is accessible as well for large families, but also people with disabilities as well. So yeah, stronger eviction protections and tenant protections, and you know, the province really embracing its role as a social housing provider is something that the NDP needs to get behind. Those are my points. How's Alison's audio?
We're trying again. How's this?
Sounds great.
Yeah. Sorry, everyone. Yeah, so like I was saying, or well, you probably didn't hear me, but my name is Alison, my pronouns are she, her, and I am a board member at Public Interest Alberta, and I'm also an organizer at Climate Justice Edmonton. So I'm going to talk a little bit about rent control and why that's important, as well as landlord licensing. But I also do want to make that connection between, you know, a lot of people have a lot of anxiety and a lot of thoughts about climate change in the environment, and having good quality housing is absolutely essential in the face of the climate emergency. Thinking especially about heating and cooling needs, having a place to live that isn't, for example, in a floodplain or at imminent risk from other climate-related disasters. And then also, as we think about affordability, crises around energy, as well as energy transition, have a lot of potential impact for renters in particular, given our more precarious financial position. And as landlords take environmental action, which they should, again, to protect us, and also as all of us, need to do in order to, again, meet the scope and the scale of crisis, it is so important that renters aren't priced out of rental housing as desirable energy retrofits and other kinds of renovations are made, basically as another kind of like green renoviction. But also, when we're talking about things like rent control, basically what that means is that when you live in a place, the rent wouldn't go up above, a certain percent every year. And right now in BC, for example, they just passed a rent cap at 2%. So the rent in the place that you live would not be able to go up more than 2%. In Alberta, there is no rent control at all. So another way to figure out to get more information about what's out there and what the rental stock looks like would be a rental registry. So rental price of every rental unit in the province tracked in a registry in order to get a fuller understanding of where, how, and if rents are rising to unaffordable levels. Data from the registry could be used to create informed affordable policies and regulations in the future, especially when thinking about, again, a rent cap. We need rent control because rents are rising faster than people's incomes and regular people's incomes are not catching up. Alberta has very little protection for tenants. There's no rent control, meaning that there's no limit to how much your landlord can raise your rent every year. This is also an area where landlords can use the current lack of rent control as a form, basically, of evicting someone that they don't like. This could be based on a whole bunch of different things that could put a landlord into the position of violating someone's human rights, but because it's just them increasing the rent, it's not illegal. So it's also a potential area for discrimination currently. When tenants are faced with a bad landlord or a big rent increase, it can be extremely difficult to find a new place to live that you can afford. This results in many tenants being reluctant to end their tenancy even in bad situations. And when that does happen, people are forced to leave their neighborhoods. This can be a vector for gentrification and can also have other negative impacts on health and children being able to access schools and things like that. So people being priced out and pushed out of their neighborhoods is a big issue in Alberta cities as well as across the country. Prices for a one-bedroom rental in Calgary have risen by over 27% in the past year, making it one of the biggest hikes in rent prices in the country. The average two-bedroom rental in Calgary is now going for $1,934 a month, according to an August 2022 rent report by rentals.ca. The result of this being that working people and families are being squeezed by the cost of housing even more than ever before. In Canada, BC, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, EI, Quebec, all have variations of rent control. Over 75% of Canada's population lives in a place where renters are protected by some form of control, and Alberta is not part of that. Provinces with rent control are thriving. For example, Boardwalk, which is a Calgary-based company, many of you might have rented from them in the past or currently rent from them now, is currently expanding into Ontario, a place that does have rent control, showing that landlords, especially big landlords, still see that there are ways that they will profit even in places that have rent control, but rent control does still benefit tenants. Also, we need landlord licensing in this province to update and enforce apartment standards through, for example, rules that do exist on standards of apartment rentals are not enforced currently. As cities try to promote density through permissive garden suite and basement suite legislation, which is important, again, in the context of energy transition, livability, more and more people are becoming landlords without any requirement to know what their responsibilities are or the regulations that are currently in place. This puts renters in a vulnerable position of renting from people that don't know what they're doing and are going to treat them poorly. Also, by licensing landlords, the province would be able to ensure that apartment standards are met through proactive enforcement, paid for by the collection of nominal fee per unit that would be levied against landlords. Licensing would also enable the province to ensure that the invaluable affordable housing stock in Alberta is protected, that hundreds of thousands of tenant families are living in healthy and safe homes. This would complement other moves towards non-market housing and other kinds of improved affordable housing types of schemes. Toronto, Brampton, and Mississauga in Ontario all have past forms of landlord licensing. And again, those are places where landlords still exist. So it's not going to get rid of rental housing completely or at all. And I'll pass it back to Laura.
Thanks so much to Kyla and Alison for that kind of backgrounder. Right now, what we want to do with the vast majority of our time is open it up for discussion. So if folks want to throw their questions for Alison and Kyla into the Q&A box. Geez Louise, can't talk. That would be awesome, and we'll kind of like get it started. One thing that I was thinking about, Alison, you mentioned green renovictions. You mentioned the word renoviction. I actually experienced myself, I'm a renter, I experienced a renoviction a few years ago. I came home one night to a letter that was slipped under my door, which said that I had basically 4 months to vacate my unit because they were changing it into an office building when we moved. After they didn't change it into an office building, they sold it to another developer who updated the units, and now the units are back on the market at twice the amount. So could you talk, maybe either of you, a little bit more about renovictions, and it's kind of like, how do we stop that from happening as well?
Who do you want to do that, Alison, or do you want me to jump in first?
You go first, Kyla.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, for people who may not know, renoviction is an eviction justified by the landlord saying they need to do renovations that are so significant that you can't be in the apartment while they happen. So, and they take a long time, so most people are forced to move out. And then dem eviction is similar. It's when you're evicted because a landlord is going to completely demolish your rental unit and then build something else. So yeah, you know, one thing that we do fight for and partially have in Ontario is the first right of refusal. So in Ontario, when in a renoviction, you're basically able to move back into your unit if the landlord wants to renovate in a way that you have to move out. It's still super difficult for people though, because, you know, like it's not a week, right? It can take years sometimes for people to move back into their apartment. So oftentimes, you know, people don't want to move back after they've settled into a new place. And also, you know, oftentimes they'll use it to jack up the rent, right? So, you know, it's oftentimes like double the rent, you know, when you move back. So yeah, you know, rules around first right of refusal that, you know, would allow a tenant to move back in at the same rent that they were currently paying is super important. Does that help? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And they have similar protection in BC as well, so that tenants have a right to return to their suite. And you know, this is a really tricky one because thinking about gentrification, which is sort of similar, but where overall, you know, regular working class people are pushed out of neighborhoods in favor of wealthier individuals. Firstly, people might not feel super welcome coming back to neighborhoods they've lived in for a long time as that transition happens, but also thinking about housing quality and the need in a lot of cases for there to be substantial improvements to rental housing to make it high quality enough to be like a dignified place to live is really, really hard to strike that balance. And so things like rent eviction protection be one way where a landlord may, be empowered to make those changes, but that a tenant can afford to come back.
I just saw a comment in the chat here from Sam Mason, who said, I told my landlord he needed to put my damage deposit into a trust and give me back a percentage per year. I did not know that they were supposed to do that. Are they supposed to do that? And he told me that he wasn't going to. Oh, Alison has the finger up.
Super interesting.
She's got something to say.
So Sam's right. They are supposed to do that, but the percent back per year has been set at 0 since the aughts. It used to be a required percentage return per year, but now it's 0. And so they'll never give you more than you put in, even though, of course, they've put it in savings or into a trust and it has accrued wealth for them and they're holding it.
So it looks like we need to advocate on that as well.
But then there's also just, landlords being able to just tell you that they're not going to do something that they're supposed to do. And there's no enforcement. Like, who is supposed to hold these landlords accountable? Well, it's the province and the provincial government, and they're not doing it, which is why we need things like landlord licensing.
Have a question here. Could you speak about the process to get a change through this government?
Thanks, Merle. I think that's a really, really good question. I will also note that, so in 2017 and 18, I was part of a group called Renters Action Movement in Calgary, where we were advocating for things like rent control under an NDP government. We had one champion in the government, but the NDP themselves were completely unwilling to champion renters' rights and to champion renter protections. And so advocating just at that level didn't work for us. And so what we do actually need is a bigger movement of regular renters and allies of renters who are working together towards action for improving renters' rights and for things like rent control, landlord licensing. It's not just a matter of like making a really good case to the government because they don't care. Many NDP and UCP MLAs are also landlords, and their friends are landlords because they're wealthy people. To the best of my knowledge, there are no renters in our legislature. And I think that's a really big problem because about 1/3 of Albertans are renters. And so, or 1/3 of Albertan households are renting households, but we don't have representation in the halls of power. So that's why it's important to get together on calls like these, and then also to build the movement of regular people that are fighting for that, simply because lobbying just doesn't work for us.
Yeah, I completely 100% agree with Alison. Our politicians, a lot of them are landlords, but even when they're not, they've got more in common with landlords a lot of the time than they do with regular people or low and moderate income people. And so, yeah, oftentimes lobbying doesn't work. So it's power in numbers. Like the politicians, even the ones that are our allies, they need to be feeling pressured to do the things that their constituents want. So, that's why grassroots organizing is so important. And that work needs to happen, between elections and always, because it's not something that happens fast. It's something that takes a lot of work. And then, once we have organized tenants and people who care about these issues, being in the media, doing actions, constantly talking to our neighbors, being vocal about these things is what's going to actually, at the end of the day, in my view, push the NDP to do what we want.
Another question here from Aaron, who is the ED over at the Campus Food Bank at the University of Alberta, who just shared in a meeting that the food bank saw record numbers of people accessing their service over the past little while. So I think that obviously points to a huge crisis that is brewing on our campuses. Are there any organizations advocating for students in the housing market? At U of A, we hear especially of international students viciously disrespected and taken advantage of by landlords.
So maybe Alison or Laura would know more about other Alberta organizations, but ACORN doesn't just work on housing. We're a multi-issued organization because people don't live single-issue lives, right? Housing is not the only issue that people face, and they're all interconnected. So, we're built up of members, and we have a lot of members who are students, and then, members decide what we want to work on. So, campaigns around students' rights, it's not out of our wheelhouse at all.
Alison, I don't know if you had anything to add there. Yeah, I'm not aware of anybody who does specifically looking at students in the housing market, but yeah, I think that there's also, I think that I might be wrong on this, but I believe that student housing and residences are not governed by the landlord, the Alberta Tenant Act, whatever that is called. And I think that they have like very, very few rights when they are in student housing. And this is obviously particularly impactful on international students who are treated like cash cows to, fill the gaps left by the gouging of our universities by the provincial governments. It's all interrelated for sure. Alison, I don't know if you wanted to add anything or. Nope, good, okay. Thanks. So yeah, I would definitely, Erin, it sounds like those international students deserve to be creating an organization that we are supporting in their in their pursuit of fair treatment on all kinds of different levels, because what's happening to international students is just unconscionable on so many different levels. So Sam asks, what is the argument against rent control from politicians, especially as one of the only provinces without it?
Well, that's a really good question, and you're going to hear a lot of things if you start talking to people about rent control. So the first thing is that like a lot of people, the majority of Albertans and the majority of Canadians are homeowners, and that's true. And fighting for renters' rights doesn't negate that most people are landlords. Regular people often are more likely to identify with the landlord than they are with the renter in any situation, even though most people have rented at some point in their life. I think there's also a general assumption in society that renters always want to become homeowners, and that's not always true, especially as regular working people see their share of the wealth decrease hugely over time. I think more and more of us see ourselves as likely not being able to own property. And so we're looking at more people who are lifelong renters. There's also people, across the world whose cultures are of lifelong renting. And so when you talk about things like rent control to regular people, much less politicians, you're likely to hear things like, well, how are they supposed to make money? A lot of tenants are bad tenants. They trash your home. Protecting them isn't as important as protecting the rights of the landlord. And in particular with rent control, you hear a lot about how landlords should be able to make a living and that they'll be bankrupted by their tenant if there are things like rent control in place. But of course, that's not true. There are places across North America, as well as around the world, where there are rent controls that help keep people in their home for a long period of time. But they're still landlords. They still exist. As much as that might not be the goals of many of the people here, it is, the reality in which we live. So usually people are using that. And then in general, like people really do, like I was saying, people really hate renters. And so you don't need to make a particularly robust case that's based on facts and figures to just say like they don't deserve any protections. The people that deserve the benefit of this situation are landlords, and anyone who has a home has a right to become a landlord, which when you really think about it is pretty messed up. So yeah, you will hear a lot of things.
Yeah, for sure. If I can just mention a couple things, I was actually making like a comeback sheet because I was anticipating a lot of this, not from here, obviously, but from, other people and like politicians and stuff, and when we talk to the media. So, you know, the UCP specifically, and even Jason Kenney all the time, you know, makes an argument that rent control hinders development. You know, I just moved from Ontario, but Ontario and BC have rent control, and development is everywhere. Those provinces are thriving, and like that's literally not true. And an example that Alison mentioned, which I think makes a lot of sense, that Boardwalk is a company that is expanding into Ontario. So it's, you know, going from a province that has no rent control, expanding into a province that does have rent control. So, you know, companies know, and landlords know that they can make money, you know, even when there's rent control. Rent control, I've also heard like rent control hinders the landlord's ability to keep up with maintenance and repairs. I mean, being a landlord is a super lucrative business. Landlords aren't hurting right now. You know, there's no rent control in Alberta right now, and still a lot of landlords still don't keep up with repairs, right? Like, it's not even a question of whether or not they can afford it. It's a question of enforcing adequate standards in conjunction with like fair rent prices. But also, like, yeah, nobody's entitled to be a landlord, you know, simply by the virtue of owning property. So if your margins are too slim to maintain a property to an adequate standard, then you shouldn't be a landlord. You know, sell that property and give it someone a chance to own a family home that they won't be evicted from. You know, a portion of your rent is supposed to go towards maintenance. It's not all simply to be profit for landlords. Yeah, so, you know, maintenance and repairs is already not happening for a lot of people. So it's really not a good argument. And then what I also, last one that I hear a lot is like, what about good landlords? What about small landlords? Yeah, they definitely exist. But I think like if good landlords are already keeping their units affordable for their tenants by not raising rents, this won't change things for them then. You know, the reality is that there's like many bad landlords who are hiking rent. And so rent control will stop bad landlords from doing that. So I honestly think that good landlords should support rent control, you know, so that everyone has to play by those same rules. But at the end of the day, I kind of think about it as, you know, if a landlord you know, doesn't get the rent, the worst thing that can happen to them is that they lose their investment property. But if someone is evicted, the worst thing that can happen to them is that they could die. And those things aren't equal. Like, they're just not in any way. So someone's life at the end of the day is more important than someone's investment. And if you're making the argument the other way around, I think a majority of people understand that doesn't sound good. Like, it doesn't look good to say, you know, someone's investment is more important than someone's life. Yeah. So those are the main things that I've been hearing and have like written a comeback sheet towards.
That's awesome. I hope that we will all get a copy of the comeback sheet as we work further on this issue. Another question from Sam. Thank you, Sam, for so many great questions. Is there truth to, and or why do I hear the rhetoric that we have the cheapest rents in the country because we don't have rent control? I feel like I see that come up a lot, and I'm not savvy enough about it to know how to counter that talking point.
It wouldn't be cheap if they could charge more, you know, like yeah. I think there's a lot of complex factors that go into the price of rentals, and I certainly don't know them either, Sam, but it makes no sense to me at all. And like, again, good question. And you do hear stuff like this a lot. This isn't a knock on you, you hear it, but it doesn't make any sense that we would have the cheapest rents if there's no control on how much rent they could charge. If they could charge $2,500, $3,000, $10,000 a month for a unit and it would get rented, they would do that. There are other factors like you know, how many Albertans are so close to not being able to their financial obligations, like the UCP and governments before it trashing our education and healthcare systems, making this place a tough place to live or a tough place to consider moving to. other factors like boom and bust economies that mean that people's incomes and their job security go up and down every 5 to 10 years. All those factors are probably more likely why rents, especially in Edmonton, but across the province, may be lower than other big cities. But as we saw in Calgary, where rents increased 27% last year, as we're having record inflation, record corporate profits, record share buybacks for oil companies and other big corporations, as regular people are suffering financially and now paying more in rent, not having rent control does not mean that housing is suddenly affordable.
I think that anybody that kind of like makes that point that it's cheaper because of that it's just backwards. Because yeah, I remember I was watching I was doing a writing for a piece that I was doing, and there was the Manhattan Institute had hosted Jason Kenney. Manhattan Institute is a Koch funded like libertarian, pro free market, no regulation, privatization kind of like think tank in New York. And he described Alberta as the beating heart of free market values in Canada. And the free market values are the reason why the province is prosperous despite having those, like has nothing to do with those rules, right? It's like that, it's like you were saying, Alison, this like boom and bust economy, all these other things are the reasons why this province is both very difficult and very good in different times and in different ways. So I just think that like, yeah, we have cheap rents because of this complex array of things. The fact that we have no rent controls means that, like where people are so uniquely vulnerable to being put on the razor's edge of homelessness or being kicked out of their homes. And, we saw as like we dealt with the disproportionate, like the ways that our governments in this kind of like pursuit of this free market ideology throw people in the way and like throw people under the bus in service of that ideology is just staggering in this province. Like we look at the number of people who died from COVID-19 per capita in our province versus others is just staggering. So it's just all part of this whole big ideology that we need to push against all parties, not just the UCP, against the NDP as well. So yeah, that was kind of a rambling answer, but it makes me frustrated when people are ascribing any kind of positive outcome to this kind of free market ideology, because it's just one of suffering for everyone except for a few people at the top. So Kim asks, for the landlords that are incorporated, whether small or big as a business, they receive a lot of rental property deductions so that they can use to minimize their taxes. How could this be added into the argument for why we need rent control?
I mean, you made the argument yourself. They get financial benefits for being landlords, and renters certainly don't. I don't get a tax break for giving my landlord 30 to 50% of my take-home income, while people who have wealth in all kinds of different ways do get breaks. Real estate wealth, capital gains wealth, all kinds of other things. It is cheaper to be rich than it is to be poor.
Sweet. Are there more questions that folks have?
I can just maybe just touch on something from the chat. Is that okay?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Just Sam said I'd like to see something like this in Alberta, and then link to the Toronto Rent Safe program. So that's a version of landlord licensing. And so like Toronto ACORN has like run that campaign for rent safe for years. And so that's like an example of what landlord licensing could look like in Alberta. So absolutely.
Oh, another question popped up. Can you list off the big asks off quickly? Rent control, licensing. So it was rent control, licensing, eviction protections.
And expanding social housing.
Are we missing any?
Like under that, there's like repealing Bill 78, but that's like under the social housing umbrella.
Yeah. I think that in the coming days, ACORN just did a big launch today of a organizing drive in Calgary, and has all these points very clearly laid out. You'll be able to see tons of media and news about this. I'll definitely put together an email with this session, as well as some of the clips that will be coming out of that press conference. So we will definitely, there will definitely be ways to look at these things before we all go to the NDP renter consultation next Tuesday. Any other questions, or we can wrap up early? Oh. So yeah, I'm seeing if we are working on dismantling the mentality that the landlords have, we need to be able to speak to the benefits that landlord gets versus what renters are not getting, so they can get deductions for a huge amount of things here: office expenses, professional fees, property taxes, travel, utilities, motor vehicle expenses, prepaid, you know, all kinds of different things, salaries, wages, benefits. All this pretty much avoids the argument on their side against rent control, does it not?
Totally. Landlords
Once
get their
again,
own benefits and protections. This is like the bare minimum that tenants need. Tenants need those protections as well. Completely, I agree with you, 100%.
Yep, you answered your own question again, Kim.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a great point, right? Is there's so many incentives that landlords receive, and you know, the argument is that they take a risk, so they like deserve the profits that come out of it. It's like they have so many benefits that are inbuilt into owning an asset, owning a hard asset. And you know, so many people are, again, on the razor's edge of poverty and precarity, or you know, are middle income and not able to save for their own property. And you know, we know that intergenerational wealth is like a huge way that wealth is transferred and wealth is hoarded, and owning property is a major component of that. So I think with that, we'll kind of start to wind things down here. So like we mentioned when we were advertising this session, the purpose behind it is to get us all aligned in terms of talking about things before the NDP consultation next week. So have you all registered for that consultation? I'm going to pop it into the chat right now. Have you registered? If you have, just put done into the chat. Lots of dones there. Okay, now ACORN just put out a new mode tool that will send a letter to all the different political parties demanding that rent control be a major point in their political platform. So I just popped that into the chat, and everybody can kind of pop into there and send it off. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to do that now. . Just saw a question in the chat as well. Is there a strategy for us in that consultation? I think that it's hard to know exactly how they're going to proceed with it. Brad, are you still on the call?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Do you have more insight on how they run these consultations?
Yeah, I attended a previous consultation about 6 months ago as part of Alberta's Future, and it went basically how you would expect it. There was an introduction by the MLA who is responsible for the critic area, so we'll probably have some intros from I think it's Laurie Sigurdsson, Seniors in Housing, and maybe introductions from the other MLAs who are going to be attending. There's 3 other MLAs there. And then they turn it over to attendees to basically like raise their hand or put, something in the Q&A or chat function to indicate they want to speak, and will, let you speak for a minute or two and ask any questions. Typically, one or a couple of them respond to each person who speaks or asks a question, and then they go to the next speaker. I think that, just a kind of like note on approach, that like personal stories, insofar as people are comfy with sharing them, would be really, really powerful. And using ACORN's materials and the 4 points that we talked about tonight from Alison and Laura as well in regards to policy, so that we're repeating ourselves as much as possible would be a good strategy. But plan to speak for about a minute or two and ask any pointed questions that you might have at the end of your presentation.
So maybe what we could do after we, Kyla, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Brad said. And yeah, when I'm trying to get, our demands across, something I tell like members, especially when they're talking to media or politicians, is include a personal story if you can, because that's super powerful, but then end each sentence, if you can, with the demands. So, making sure you're not this is strategy, not like telling you what to do, but like, making sure that you're listing the demands also, like after your personal story, so that basically they get inundated with similar or the same demands from so many of us, basically. So the formula I usually give people is like personal experience, personal story, followed by demand, and like doing that as much as possible.
And I think that what we can do to just kind of like reinforce what we've done here tonight is I will send this video out to everyone who's registered, and I'll send just a written down list of everybody's points that we covered tonight. And then maybe hopefully maybe we'll be able to kind of include the rent control talkback sheet that you were talking about, Kyla. That'd be cool to have as well. And we can make sure that everybody's kind of aligned on there. Sweet. Okay, so yeah, also the last thing that everybody needs to do in here is to invite friends to come, to invite people who are renters to come to this consultation. Bring even more people, share this video with them, share the points that we've discussed, so that we are reaching as many people as possible. Because at the end of the day, what's going to win us these things is not the government giving them to us, it's us fighting for them. They've never, given something freely. It always takes a concerted effort from a group of people, a group of working people working together to make these changes happen. So just to wrap up today, thank you so much to Kyla and to Alison. Kyla, where can people find out more about ACORN and ACORN Alberta?
Sure, absolutely. Well, thanks for letting me join. It was super fun. And yeah, so for ACORN, I will put some stuff in the chat here. But yeah, any of our social media, like if you search Alberta ACORN or AB ACORN in any social media, it will come up. We post everything there. Getting it added into our email list is great as well. I'll just put my email in the chat if that's okay. People can reach out if they want.
Alison, same question about Climate Justice Edmonton.
For sure. Of course, also with Public Interest Alberta, definitely follow and keep tabs on this campaign. And with Climate Justice Edmonton, we're also making a election-related campaign that we're planning to launch in the next few weeks. So you can follow us on Instagram at Climate Justice Edmonton or on Twitter at CJ Edmonton, where we do environmentally focused, but also social justice-y type campaigning and host lots of events and other kinds of community-based activism.
Sweet. Yeah, just kind of adding on to that, couple of things from Public Interest Alberta. We have our annual general meeting coming up on the 29th, which is going to be a lot of fun. We have as a guest speaker, Angela McEwen from CUPE National, who will be talking there. She's the senior economist for CUPE, just like a lefty economist, really cool. And we're very excited to be hosting her. And the best way to stay involved with us is to subscribe to the mailing list. Very important to note that this conversation that we're having here is just the beginning. This consultation that the NDP is having is just one step in many. This is by no means the final thing that we're going to be doing about this issue. This is just just to kind of get the ball rolling and get people like yourselves get all of us kind of skilled up so that we can share in the fight for renter protections. Yeah, so thank you, all of you, for being here and for your commitment to advocating for renter protections. And I am going to be looking forward to giving all the political parties hell over the next year. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the night.